Welcome back to Britain's Newsroom. And a new report has argued that the religion of Islam is more connected with UK grooming gang criminality than ethnicity.
The report's been published by Christian Concern and explores possible influences of Islamic theology and law on grooming gangs in the UK, arguing that commentary has often focused on ethnicity rather than religion as a potential driver of the abuse.
Now, the report instead found that religion has a stronger correlation than ethnicity when it comes to criminality around the grooming gangs. And a spokesperson from Christian Concern who commissioned this report, Tim Dieppe, joins us now. Tim, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
I read this report in full last night, and it's a very powerful report, and it goes through some interpretations of how Islam might be used by grooming gang members to justify their behaviour. Can you tell us more?
Yes, well, it's written by Dr. Mark Dury, who is an Australian academic expert on Islam and Islamic theology, and he highlights in particular 8 significant doctrines of Islam that have been used or can be used to justify some of the horrific abuse that we've all heard about with these grooming gangs, and he kind of argues that it ought to be called Islamic grooming gangs rather than Asian, which is a much broader term, or even Pakistani, because there are different ethnicities involved. And he says there's doctrines like the treatment of women and the superiority of Muslims over non-Muslims in the Quran, the treatment of, the way that women ought to dress and cover up or hide themselves in the presence of men, the no actual age of consent or minimum age of marriage in terms of Islamic theology. Even justification of sex slaves can be found in the Quran and in Islamic theology and Hadith, and he saw that with Islamic State reviving that kind of idea. So he's saying a lot of this stuff can be justified with Islamic theology and has been 8 different doctrines involved, and therefore we ought to be alert to that. And of course we've seen the government try to commission and launch a national inquiry into this, and 5 grooming gang victims who were initially on the panel resigned, and part of their complaint, well, perhaps the main part of their complaint, was really sort of expanding the remit of the inquiry and not looking at religion was one of their key complaints, because they've seen this in their abuse, they've experienced it, and part of their abuse has been religious in motivation and origin, sometimes forced into Sharia marriages, called kafir, referred to as worthless, and you're referred to as because you're non-Muslim, we're justified in abusing you in this way, and all of that kind of thing has happened. That's in the testimonies of victims that we've read and that are in this report here. So you can see that Islam is a key factor in very much of this abuse.
Do we know if any of the men who've been convicted, who were perhaps Pakistani origin, were citing the Quran as a defence? Some
of the victims have said yes, they cited the Quran. They even got sometimes their victims to memorise parts of the Quran. They read it out. They prayed ahead of abusing them. We helped one victim who'd had 4 forced Sharia marriages to her perpetrators, the people who abused her, and then of course they divorced them, just saying I divorced you 3 times. All of that kind of thing goes on as well. So there has been, in some cases, not necessarily all cases, a very significant Islamic aspect to this abuse that is not being talked about. This is partly why we commissioned this report, wanted to get this report out to say, look, Islam is a factor in this and we can't ignore it. And if you're going to look at it properly and have a national inquiry, as we should, then religion ought to be talked about as well, not just ethnicity. And that's a key factor, and that the victims themselves want to see it properly addressed.
And one of the points that the report makes is that because the West and our country's become so secular, we have forgotten how important religion is in setting culture. So we've almost ignored the influence of Islam and thought, well, how can that possibly justify anybody's behaviour? Or we've thought of all religions as being like Christianity, which obviously does place women as equal, doesn't allow treatment like that.
Yes, exactly. There's a real religious illiteracy in our culture at the moment, and an assumption that all religions are sort of effectively equal. I remember discussing with colleagues in my workplace when I worked in finance, and I'd say, well, actually, Muhammad was a war leader and he killed lots of people. And they're like, that can't be true. He's a religious leader, because they're thinking about it in terms of Christianity. Well, historically, that is true. That's clearly in the doctrine of Islam. That's in the history of Muhammad. That's in the text that Muslims revere. So, yes, we're sort of not really understanding Islam. Many people in our culture don't understand what Islam is really like, haven't read the text themselves, including most Muslims, actually, haven't read the Quran for themselves, don't really know what it teaches. They're kind of cultural Muslims, have a sense of, well, we go have this community and this kind of religion without really understanding what it's like. But what we're saying is, if you do look at the text, and if you do think think about what the teaching is, you do look at the example of Muhammad and so on, then you can find this justification, you can find this teaching, and sadly it's really bad for the women and so on, the victims of these horrific abuses.
So lots of Muslims would say, no, absolutely, grooming gangs cannot be justified by Islam, but essentially the report's saying that there are texts in Islam that some men could have used to back up their behaviour.
And have used, and also another aspect of the report is that this hasn't just been exclusively in the UK. It's been in other countries as well. We saw, for example, Boko Haram capturing Christian girls in Nigeria, and there's various other places as well where we've seen this. So, yeah, we think it's like a UK exclusive thing, never been seen anywhere else. Well, actually, it's been seen, in a sense, all through the history of Islam in terms of its treatment of non-Muslim women in the Islamic cultures.
It's quite important that police and prosecutors read this report.
It is. Yes, we want everyone to read it, and it should be read by every participant in an inquiry that goes on as well, and people should properly understand, and we're urging them really to take account of the religious aspects, as has not been really done up to now.
Yeah.
Well, Tim Dieppe from Christian Concern, thank you so much for joining us to discuss that report. And joining us now is the Director of Domestic Policy from Pickthall House, Jacob Williams, who is a Muslim. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us. You will have heard that discussion with Tim. To what extent do you think that aspects of Islam have been used to justify some of the behaviour of those caught in grooming gangs?
Well, I think the first thing I could say, which neither the report nor Tim would deny, is the vast majority of British Muslims like myself unequivocally condemn these appalling crimes and don't think they're in any way religiously sanctioned, and indeed support a full national inquiry into what's going on. Now, the report is actually rather more nuanced, I think, than Tim's presentation made it sound. The report, in fact, acknowledges that the so-called street Islam of these disgusting criminals isn't actually even the most conservative, most literalist interpretation of Islam. Even the most literalist positions don't endorse the criminal behaviour these people are doing. Now, what the report then says is that some of these literalist positions could be interpreted by, and indeed have been interpreted by, deeply pathological individuals as justifying their disgusting crimes. That is no doubt true, and that is true of those individuals. What's also quite sad to see from Tim is really presenting a quite theologically illiterate presentation of Islam as the most literalist, simplistic readings of the
But Jacob,
Quran.
it's not just anecdotal, it's not just theoretical. We have the actual evidence from the trials of the victims speaking about being forced to memorise the Quran, being forced into Sharia marriages, religion being used as a justification for their abuse.
Well, I'm not denying that. And I'm not denying that, as I just said, deeply pathological individuals are manipulating, are using, are abusing certain highly literalist interpretations of Islam to justify their disgusting crimes. Now, a large part of the reason that this behavior occurs, isn't to do with even these most literalist interpretations, which don't support this behavior, but rather is to do with particular kinds of a small minority among Pakistani communities from very, very tribal backgrounds. This is why it happens in Pakistan as well in certain places, where people haven't really adopted kind of civic norms of treating strangers well, core British values like this. And it's really in large part about tribalism and these highly isolated micro communities among certain subsections of the community, rather than about theology actually justifying this. I mean, because that, as even the report acknowledges, isn't really what's going on.
These things are happening in Rochdale and Rotherham. They weren't happening in a remote Pakistani community.
No, but if you look at the backgrounds of these people and their ethnic backgrounds, I think you'll find that was the ultimate origin of many of the individuals involved. Sorry?
And some were born here.
Yes, and we all know there's been issues with integration, as this channel has said many, many times. So, of course, you would expect that many people who were born here haven't fully integrated.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but Jacob Williams, thank you so much for coming on this morning.